We start by thanking the Nordic Committee on Bioethics, and especially Truls Pettersen, for this kind invitation. For it is an honor to speak on this very timely conference. Good morning. Forensic genetic technologies have constituted a major change in criminal investigation. These technologies have rightly been acclaimed and viewed as constituting a golden standard in the realm of forensic research and identification. Yet while forensic DNA has been heralded as the ultimate identifier of the individual suspect, a truth machine, in the words of Mike Lynch and his colleagues, it had also been haunted by the specter of race. First in controversies in the early 90s around population substructure and the relevant reference population as to calculate a likelihood ratio, and more recently in relation to novel uses such as DNA phenotyping and associated technologies. In my talk, I focus on this race trouble by introducing you to two Dutch forensic cases that have been emblematic and powerful in many ways. I hope to show that while race is part and parcel of novel forensic genetic technologies, this doesn't mean that we should throw them in the bin, but rather that we have to be more rigorous about what ethics means in these practices. I want to argue that we should move from an ethics of principles, of do's and don'ts, to a practice-oriented ethics, an ethics of care. Through these two cases, I will zoom in on how the care for the technology went hand in hand with care for the community. Now, ever since it made its appearance in various criminal justice systems some 30 years ago, the use of forensic DNA has shifted from being solely a tool to identify a suspect by comparing a profile found at the crime scene to that of the suspect at hand, into an important investigative tool, a tool in the criminal investigation aimed at generating a suspect. The general acceptance of forensic DNA, but also the advancement in genetic research, as well as the fact that our DNA databases got filled, have made it possible to produce clues about the identity of the unknown suspect. And there are various ways of producing such clues. The first and obvious one is to compare the profile of the unknown suspect to DNA databases in a hope to find a full match. Another option is a population dragnet, inviting people in the population to donate DNA as to find the suspect among them. Yet another possibility is called familiar searching, consisting of database searches or population dragnets that are aimed at near matches. Finding a relative, a brother, father, uncle, would lead you to the suspect himself. And then a final option that I would like to mention here is DNA phenotyping, the inference of visible characteristics about the unknown suspect from DNA. And some have claimed that these technologies will give you the face of the individual suspect. A very compelling promise, but as yet, no more than that. By contrast, and inevitably, most of these techniques rely on the community, a community of relatives, a community that is located in place and time, or an ethnic community in which the suspect is expected to be found. And it is this aspect of the technology, its dependence on a relevant community, that makes race a matter of concern. I grew interested in the issue of race and forensics, especially when our government introduced a law to regulate DNA phenotyping. This law states that DNA research aimed at discovering the identity of the unknown suspect could include research into the sex, but also race and other externally visible characteristics of the unknown person, eyes, hair color, skin color. What was alarming to me was this introduction of race, biological race, in the criminal code. This was even more puzzling in the light of all the research in population genetics that demonstrate that any alleged claim of biological race is untenable. Now, the Dutch law of 2003 that you can see here literally allows for genetic research into the race of the unknown suspect. And the obvious question then is, What is race made to be in forensic practice? How does biological genetic race or genetic research on difference, interfere with other notions of difference, notions of race and racism in society, including notions that are current in the criminal investigation? Now, these concerns had resulted in a large ERC consolidator project that is focusing on the giving of a face to an unknown person, a suspect or a victim of crime. Our entry point into the issue of race are three forensic technologies: facial composite drawing that is based on eyewitness accounts, craniofacial reconstructions, and DNA phenotyping. And examining how race comes about and comes to matter in science, in forensic research, but also in criminal investigation, we have been attentive to the relation between the individual and the population. This relation in the traffic from laboratory to forensic settings and to society. Therein we focus on how the population becomes racialized. But let me now move on and introduce you to the first emblematic case around which both legislation and forensic technology revolved in the Netherlands. And many of you will be familiar with this case, as it is one of the most mediatized cases, and it has meanwhile acquired international fame. It is the Mariana Factor case. As a 16-year-old girl, Mariana was out celebrating Queen's Day, a former national day on the 31st of April. Her body was found the next day in a meadow in Kolm, a village in Friesland in the northern part, rural part of the Netherlands. She was raped and killed. The case was disturbing and traumatic for the immediate community, but it also mobilized and entertained the minds of people nationwide. And one of the reasons for this national dismay had to do with the assumed prime suspects of the crime. Mariana's body was found not far from an asylum seeker center and caused the local population to place its inhabitants under suspicion. In addition, and underlining these assumptions of them, was the so-called manner of death. It was initially assumed that the victim was killed by the slicing of her throat. This manner of death was captured by the late right-wing populist politician Pim Fortuyn in a newspaper article as a non-Dutch way of killing. The suspicion placed on the asylum seeker came with lots of violence vis-à-vis migrants in the region. 2 asylum seekers in particular had been placed under suspicion as their names and photos were broadcasted on a crime show on TV. Even though the prosecutor did not have any reason to suspect them, they were asked to supply DNA and could thus be excluded. As the situation became grim in June 2000, the prosecutor called in the help of Peter de Knijf, a population geneticist and head of one of the forensic laboratories in the Netherlands. And although it was illegal then, in fact, it was 2000, and in fact, Peter saw it as an act of civil disobedience, and because he wanted to help out in this tense situation, he decided to look into the genetic geographic descent of the unknown suspect through Y-chromosomal STRs. The result indicated that while most asylum seekers were from the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, the ancestry of the unknown suspect is most likely to be found in Northwestern Europe and probably the Netherlands. Now, in their eagerness to calm down the situation, the prosecution immediately translated this result, Northwestern European or Dutch ancestry, into the suspect is a white man. And this is interesting because here we see how race comes in. So from geographic descent, probabilistic, to color, and embodied by a man. In this translation of Western into white, was obviously completely premature because, as we know, many Black men carry Western European Y chromosomes, which is due, obviously, to the legacy of slavery and colonialism. Now, despite the DNA results, probably Northwestern European suspect, and the fact that all suspected asylum seekers could be excluded by DNA, people had held on to their suspicion. The violence and racism continued, and the asylum seeker center was closed down. In the various rounds of investigation, the fast-track case has also produced various legislations. And I've listed some of them here. So in 2001, we see the legislation DNA law on already convicted persons. So convicted persons whose profile was not included in a database and who are now forced to donate DNA material, even if they have had already served their sentence. And in 2003, the law on externally visible characteristics that I already introduced to you, DNA phenotyping law. 2012, we have DNA familiar searching. All these legislations were in place in order to help solve this case. So back to our case then. The fact that the geographic descent of the unknown suspect was hinting at the majority Dutch population was not very helpful in the criminal investigation, which indicates that DNA phenotyping technologies are particularly of use when they point in the direction of a minority population. So it has taken us more than 12 years before this heavily researched case could be solved, and the waiting was indeed for familiar searching. In April 2012, the law went into effect. In September and October, a population of 8,080 men who at the time of the crime were between 16 and 60 years old and who lived some 5 kilometers from the crime scene were asked to volunteer a biological sample. And on Monday, November 19, the famous crime journalist Peter R. de Vries tweeted, "Man arrested, white suspect, Frisian, lives 2.5 kilometers away from the crime scene, 100% DNA match." So although the work of typing all profiles was expected to take months, the forensic geneticists were lucky, and already in the first batch, a match could be found. And I'm proud to say that one of my former students in forensic science was the one to discover this full match, and she could not believe her eyes. The full match was with Jasper S., a local farmer who participated in the familiar DNA mass screening and thus became the prime suspect. Now, the people in the village were shocked. The headline of a local newspaper stated, "The suspect is white, so not an asylum seeker." And the father of Mariana stated, "So it is someone from our midst, a farmer, a white man." Now, before the DNA mass screening, it was of course a puzzle for the criminal investigators as to how to mobilize all these 8,000 plus men. In conversation with a communication expert, a folder was designed that you can see here, in which information was delivered about DNA familiar searching and explaining it to why it is important that all men participated. And as you can see, the folder does not address males. It figures a mother and a child cycling along the dike. It is an intimate family situation, but the image cycling along the dike also produces a sense of belonging to this typical area of the Netherlands. In addition, the image also is chosen. The image provides a responsibilization of mothers. Mothers who care for their children, for their daughters, are here incited to nudge their male relatives as to participate. Next to the folder, next to this campaign, the crime journalist Peter R. de Vries, you can see him here, who has been involved in the case from the start and who the local population trusted all the way, was asked to dedicate one of his highly successful TV shows on the case and on familiar searching. He there disclosed a new scenario about the crime, stating that the dominant scenario went as follows. Like a predator, The predator was well prepared, and like a predator looking for a prey, he was waiting to attack Mariana from the bushes, and after that he killed her by cutting her throat. Given this modus operandus, the suspect must have been an inhabitant of the asylum seeker center. However, so we learn, he tells us, novel insights indicate that Mariana was not killed by the knife. She was first strangled by her bra, and only after she died, the knife was used to slice her throat. So thus changing ideas about the crime. He then spoke directly to the local population, addressing them that the crime was probably committed by someone from the community. So they were addressed as a community and explaining that the only way to solve this crime is to discover the identity, and to discover the identity of the perpetrator is to participate in the DNA familiar searching initiative. Now, before moving to my second case, it is important to note that in order for the novel technologies to work, a sense of community among the population in this northern part of the Netherlands had to be created. Citizens were made into a white farmer community consisting of responsible people that wanted to contribute in order to see the perpetrator behind bars. To be sure, this is not to doubt the sorrow and motives of individuals in this area of the Netherlands, their motives and their wish to find the guy. But this is to hint at the preparatory work that went into the care for the technology in order to be successful. Now, the second case I would like to talk with you about, we will see quite a different approach to vis-a-vis the community. It is, alas, another case of rape and murder of a young girl. Milica van Doorn. On the night of June 7, 1992, the 19-year-old Milica van Doorn had been celebrating the birthday of a friend. That night, she took the bus home, but never arrived. The next day, her body was found by Pastor Jan Boersen in a ditch nearby her neighborhood in the village of Zaandam, which is not far away from Amsterdam. In the early period of the investigation, clues were few and far between. However, right after Milica's death, a witness came forward and told the police that she had seen a Turkish-looking man on a bicycle in the vicinity of the crime. And this piece of information initially offered hope for the criminal investigation. On the one hand, because it located a likely suspect in the vicinity of the crime, because of the bicycle. On the other hand, the fact that the woman spoke of a man with a Turkish appearance was also suggestive. Turkish appearance would enable the police to narrow down their search. This witness report thus became a centerpiece in the criminal investigation in the 27 years to come. Yet, as the witness description did not point at a specific person in particular, the police went by DNA. In 1992, the DNA found on Milica's body was sent to the NFI, the Dutch Forensic Institute, for comparisons with the DNA database, but did not yield a match. And over the years, the profile of this unknown suspect would be mobilized again and again in order to exclude other suspects. From 2002 until 2004, people in the vicinity of Milica had been asked for DNA samples. Families and friends could be excluded as possible suspects. And in these different DNA dragnets, the population of interest was defined in line with vernacular police knowledge that suggested that the unknown suspect is likely to have known Milica either intimately, for example, families, or in a looser sense, such as friends and acquaintance. Now, when these attempts did not yield a match, the investigator had to start taking the scenario that the suspect was not familiar to Milica's circle more seriously. But it is, of course, ethically and practically impossible to set up a DNA dragnet that includes all men in Zaandam, a village that consists of 77,000 inhabitants. So the question was, could DNA help delineate the target population? The DNA was thus sent to the lab of Peter de Knijf, the expert on biogeographic ancestry that we already encountered. His lab produced a profile based on Y chromosomal STRs and on single nucleotide polymorphism. The lab drew on two databases, the SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphism that they had in their own university, the Leiden Medical Center, and the Y chromosomal haplotype reference database that is based at the Charité in Berlin. And based on these comparisons, and given the so-called haplogroup of the suspect, which is J2A, it was concluded that the geographic ancestry of the unknown suspect was likely to be in Turkey and possibly Northern Africa. Here you see a map of this haplogroup, indicating that the red, where there's the highest frequency, is in Turkey, and there is a kind of watering down of its frequency as you move outside that circle. It is obvious that the selected population for the Netherlands, Turkey, Northern Africa has to do with a specific migration, post-war migration to the Netherlands. If you would consider this in Norway or in the UK, the ethnic groups chosen would slightly differ. Now, the information about the haplogroup was then used in 2008 to set up another dragnet. In this case, men of Turkish and Northern African descent that were living in the vicinity of the crime scene were asked to volunteer with a DNA sample, however, without success. And I should mention here that the eventual suspect, Hussein A, was approached but did not want to partake in this dragnet. 9 years later, in 2017, the criminal investigation decided to explore the last option, given the success in the Mariana Factor case. This was familiar DNA searching. Based on the geographic ancestry results, the focus was now on Turkish populations in the village of Zaandam. For this reason, the investigative team wanted to be extra careful. The Turkish community was seen as vulnerable to discrimination and marginalization. So the police team decided not to risk the criminalization of entire families. But also important to the police was the fact that the technology was rather new and that this was only the second case in which it would be used. It was thus important that it would prove successful and that the potentials of familiar searching would not be jeopardized, for example, by racist violence. And if so, you then know for sure that it would take years before the investigative judge or the board of attorneys general would consider its uses. So the investigators selected 133 men of Turkish descent who were living in the area in 1992. But they also compiled a team of experts consisting of communication expert, social scientists with expertise on the Dutch-Turkish community, but also enrolled former Minister of Justice, Ernst Hirsch-Ballin, especially for his expertise on international and political relations. The reason was that the political and diplomatic relations between Turkey and the Netherlands were tense. In March 2017, the Dutch authorities had denied Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Cavusoglu, permission to land his airplane in Rotterdam. And they had also expelled the Turkish Minister of Family and Social Policy, Sayhan Kaya. Sayhan Kaya wanted to speak to the Turkish community in the Netherlands on the upcoming referendum, a controversial topic, as this referendum would significantly strengthen the governmental party in the wake of the failed military coup in Turkey in 2016. This political situation was resonating in society and could affect the course of investigation. The police in the Milika case wanted to take care not to offend the Turkish sensibilities or to harm diplomatic relations. Thus, the investigators and their team of experts had to position the DNA research carefully and strategically. In order to successfully approach the 133 men, investigators took several steps. In the months before the start of the official collection of DNA, members of the police working group got in touch with several key members in the local Turkish community. notifying them of their plans and asking their support in case of hesitation or irritation among the members of the community, especially the 133 families. Through this, the police was soon to find out that there was no such thing as a Turkish community. A leading officer in this police working group described the Turkish community to us, in fact to Roos Hopman, who will speak later, and me, as the community that is no community. The community that is no community. Not only were there religious differences, such as between Erdogan-minded people and Gulen supporters, but also differences between left and right-wing groups, between religious and atheists, between nationalists and liberals, between Kurdish nationalists and Turkish nationalists. So, Turkishness as a quality that is assumedly shared proved to be elusive. The police thus chose a highly individualized strategy, a strategy of going door by door, talking to people, enabling them to participate right there and then by a simple swab, proved to be effective. While it was feared that the community that is no community would hesitate to participate in the DNA research, police officials were soon to learn that all requested men, except for the suspect himself, in fact, participated without hesitation. The collective mobilized and enacted through the very approach of the police was neither the genetic probabilistic collective of the Y chromosome, nor the dominant social imaginary in Dutch society of the Turkish ethnic group. Instead, the police were dealing with a community of no community, a community consisting of different families with roots in Turkey, and who were as citizens part and parcel of the Dutch society, riding bicycles, and willing to help solve brutal crimes rather than protect a suspect. So based on the profiles of 132, that is 133 minus 1, the suspect, the Dutch Forensic Institute was soon to find out that one donor in particular was most probably the brother of the unknown suspect, Hussein A. He was soon to be pointed out, Hussein A, that is, was soon to be pointed out as the suspect. And since he was the only family member who did not volunteer for the second time, he became a likely suspect and was apprehended on his way home from work and became thus a reasonable, a person on which a reasonable suspicion was placed, and thus could be forced to give a sample, so not voluntarily anymore. The sample, his DNA matched with that found on Milica van Doorn's body. Now to conclude, the two cases that I described here were meant to demonstrate that race is part and parcel of novel investigative DNA technology, such as DNA phenotyping and familial searching. And this is not to say that genetics is racist, but given the fact that this technology is mobilized in social settings where received differences, vested interests, and where political and social conflicts are ongoing, we have to take this into account. Because the differences of genetics will be conjured up with the differences that are out there in society. They will interfere. Put differently, forensic genetic differences and socio-political differences interfere. A probabilistic result, such as Northwestern European ancestry, gets translated into a white man and later on into a white farmer. So the specter of race is always there. The risk of race is something that cannot be resolved or removed through validation of sorts. It is rather a risk that needs to be taken seriously, needs to be taken care of. In the case of Vaatstra, the investigators were surprised by race. The violence and racism was a lesson that was learned for the Milica van Doorn case, where the aim was to keep race at bay. But more pragmatically, the two cases show how the investigative teams had been tinkering and thinking pragmatically about how to approach the people of interest, how not to rub them the wrong way, so to speak. Whereas in Vaatstra, they worked on consolidating a sense of community, a strong community. In the Milica van Doorn, the aim was to prevent its racialization, the racialization of the community. So they rather disaggregated the community and worked with the community of no community on an individualized basis. One could say that the care for the technology, and as I said, that's fairly new, that's fairly fragile, went hand in hand with the care for the community. One community that needed to be strengthened and the other that risked to be racialized. Finally, these cases can teach us new lessons about ethics. Although it is clear that a number of rules of engagement can and should be regulated in a more or less universal way, such as informed consent, rules about privacy, bodily integrity, time that is allowed to retain samples, etc. But many other ethical considerations, specifically considerations related to these technologies, cannot be dealt with beforehand or in general. They need to be attended to in practice on a case-by-case basis. This is, so I want to suggest, an invitation to move from an ethics of principle that is universal to an ethic of care that is very practical and situated. The latter assumes an art of paying attention, an art of considering the specificity and context of the case, to then come to an infrastructure that is needed for the DNA research, but also an infrastructure that is needed for the societal, to prevent the societal problems that might arise through the use of this novel technology. Thank you for your attention.